The regal lifestyle isn't always picture perfect. Raw moments that reveal the delicate rhythm of a family in trouble, stripped of all titles, castles, and procedures. Such an incident occurred behind closed doors at Anmar Hall, away from prying eyes and public spectacle. A mother sat her daughter down in a sun-drenched family room where laughing once reverberated, and gave news that no kid should ever have to hear. The world-renowned elegance and unbreakability of Princess Catherine's hand was on full display as she struggled to keep it steady. Sitting across from her was Princess Charlotte, who was 9 years old and still had the rosy cheeks of a child. That naivete, however, crumbled as the words slipped out of Catherine's mouth. An eerie stillness descended over the chamber. The question that broke every heart was then posed by Charlotte. "Will you abandon me just as great-grandmama did?" The royal family lost their status as royalty at that very time. Just a mother and daughter sobbing into each other's arms, crushed by the burden of reality. This was the first time the youngster, who had grown up with fairy tales and regal traditions, had to face a terror that doesn't adhere to rules or wear a crown. This is the tale of a diagnosis, but it is also the story of a little princess who gave up something important but acquired something much more meaningful. It's about reimagining the meaning of royalty and how quickly one grows up. And how the pain of loss brought a family closer together. A daughter, her family, and her country undergo a metamorphosis as we traverse 7 very human tales. A tale that started with a room full of truth and a small girl who wasn't prepared to say goodbye eventually became a lasting legacy, but it all began with tears. Suddenly, everything shifted. The family room at Anmar Hall was bathed in a gentle late afternoon light. Princess Charlotte sat cross-legged on the carpet, humming quietly as she placed her coloring pencils, as a golden hue spread throughout the room. The place had more of a cottage atmosphere than a castle due to the framed family portraits on the walls and the subtle clutter of a lived-in home. However, things were different today. The silence was anything from tranquil. The air was heavy with the tension of unspoken words. Catherine walked more slowly than normal as she softly made her way into the room. She appeared to have cried privately, as her face turned whiter and her eyes swelled. Her quavering hands fumbled for her girls as she knelt by Charlotte. "My darling," she started out with a whisper. Looking up, Charlotte could feel her mother's seriousness but couldn't help but smile. She was excited to hear her mother's secret. However, as Catherine's remarks unfolded, gentle yet unwavering, the smile disappeared. "My mother was ill." Charlotte blinked as she attempted to make sense of the sound. Like any inquisitive youngster, she began by asking questions. "Has a cold hit? How about medication?" Catherine attempted to communicate the seriousness of the diagnosis while holding back her own tears. Nonetheless, Charlotte's expression altered. Her once innocent eyes betrayed her. Her little frame tensed up. "Will you abandon me just as great-grandmama did?" Her voice quivered as she inquired. At that moment, Catherine also broke down. A mother and daughter embraced one another, free from the burden of maintaining royal decorum and protecting titles. Their sobs fading into a quivering stillness. As if her embrace might reverse the effects of what had been said, Charlotte held to her mother tightly, as if she were attempting to freeze time. This was never intended. Charlotte, who was just 9 years old, was a burst of energy who could light up any room with her infectious dance moves. She transformed into an entirely different person in that little moment, a young girl whose fears were out of proportion to her age. Catherine did her best to put her at ease. To reassure her young daughter with a kind whisper. Despite this, Charlotte persisted in sobbing, her voice increasingly disrupting the serene atmosphere of Anmar Hall. Even though they were taught to be discreet and polite, the workers could still hear the noise. Some people sobbed silently behind closed doors because they couldn't handle the reverberation of a child's loss. There, in that bright room, it was as if time stood still, enclosing them in a cocoon of sorrow from which they could feel no escape. At that very second, the monarchy became irrelevant. A girl, her mother, and a truth too great for either of them to bear alone, that was all. No headlines, no royal duties, just them. Princess Charlotte was no longer seen as a model of regal poise. She begged the cosmos to spare her mother as a tiny child crippled with loss anxiety. A stressed-out dad races back to his house. As Prince William absorbed briefing documents in his London office, the phone abruptly rang. Not the check-in that had been planned. It was passed down through Catherine's family line. The one that, barring extreme emergencies, she seldom utilized. On the very first ring, he responded. Her voice was barely inaudible as it quivered. The moment has come. It was more than enough, I told her, even if that was all she said. He skipped the security clearances and procedure checks. Minutes later, he had left the premises, his suit jacket dangling from his chair. The distance between him and Norfolk seemed to stretch on forever. As if it were his sole connection to the ground, he clung to the steering wheel. Briefings and public appearances had slipped the mind of the future king. In his desperation to keep his family united, he was merely a husband rushing home. He was slammed against a wall of quiet the moment he entered Anmer Hall. All of a sudden, there is a complete lack of the typical din of a royal household, the sound of children playing and the clink of silverware. Following his gut rather than any specific instructions, he hurried down the hall and into the family room. As the door swung wide, he was greeted by a heartbreaking scene. Catherine had not yet gotten off the floor. After sobbing for so long, Charlotte buried her head in her mother's chest. Her red-rimmed, watery eyes locked with his, and she didn't think twice. Into his arms she bolted. William knelt down and drew her near, his arms encircling her as if he could protect her from harm. The three of them sat in quiet contemplation as Catherine silently extended her hand to take his. Silent tears and the ticking of a clock were the only sounds in the room. With a slight but piercing sound, Charlotte drew back slightly to meet his gaze. Would the physicians be able to improve her fatherhood? William cast a quick glance at Catherine, who nodded at him almost imploringly, as if to convey some message, to provide her hope, or at least a grip. He gently wiped a tear off her face and assured her that they are doing all they can. The world's top doctors are taking care of Mommy. That wasn't all that Charlotte did. Is it okay if I give her the healthier, less painful pieces of myself? He was crushed by her authenticity. As only a child could, she embraced it wholeheartedly. William re-embraced her, this time with more force, kissed her on the crown of her head, and said, "If love could do it, you already have." Charlotte sat on her bed, lost in contemplation, later that night. Am I to inform George and Louis, or would it terrify them as well? No kid should ever have to ask a question like that. But Charlotte had become more than just a youngster. She had entered a world with boundaries on comfort in the space of a few hours. And courage appeared as clinging to your mother's hand throughout a tempest. We could all feel her rapid maturation as a child. Something wholly changed in the days after Catherine's diagnosis, shattering the opulence and refined manners that had long characterized life at Anmer Hall. An air of gentler, more human tenderness descended over the expansive estate, which was previously immaculate and buzzing with subtle formality. Employees shuffled about in a low voice, their expressions indicating more worry than before. The once powerful and restraining palace walls seemed to soften as they embraced a mourning child's heart. It was because of Charlotte. She could no longer hide her suffering under regal protocol. It was raw, unedited, and impactful all at once. A long-serving maid paused one morning as she silently made her way through the kitchen, clutching her cherished plush bunny to her chest. I am overcome with emotion. In a hushed tone, she spoke to another employee about how little Charlotte is as she walked past. She seemed to be staring at everything and nothing at the same time. Leasing of the daily protocol started. The royal family no longer adhered to rigid mealtime regimens. The focus instead shifted to the times when things like eating together as a family was important to Charlotte, when Catherine felt ready to sit up, or when they could find a way to laugh despite the sadness. Staff members adjusted, taking on responsibilities unrelated to their official titles or job descriptions. In Charlotte's book bag, one footman started slipping little messages of encouragement. Cocoa was made by a butler in the same manner as Catherine's. Never one marshmallow, always two. In the background, royal aides quietly pulled the family out of public view, and the tone of royal communications changed to accommodate their increasing need for privacy. Charlotte wasn't always silent, but this time the institution was on her side. Many forms were taken by her anguish. At one point, she was enraged that her mom couldn't be helped. Another was when she would crouch down beside Catherine and murmur, "I will never abandon you." Repetition, as if it could transform it into a promise sealed by time, is repeated over and over. There were days when she said nothing and gazed silently out her bedroom window into the garden, the very place where her imagination ran wild as she chased butterflies and lived out her childhood dreams. As they observed this transformation, the staff became emotionally entangled with a family that had abandoned all pretense. Even if nobody actually stated it, a lot of people sensed it. A mother's strength was not the only thing this little girl was losing. Another part of her naivete was slipping away. The hall seemed more like a house than a castle, and the usual regularity gave way to sobs. In the midst of a home full of people who had sworn allegiance not just to the crown but also to the individuals wearing it, Charlotte went through the typical grieving stages: denial, anger, bargaining, and melancholy. Plus, they weren't merely serving royalty anymore, it was their role today. They kept vigil over a distraught kid whose world had just broken open and was attempting, in their own little way, to put it back together again. There was a noticeable change in Charlotte as she made her way through Anne-Marie Hall during the transfiguration of a young princess. Her unfettered gait, unprompted laughter, and incessant curiosity about faraway castles and ponies were all gone. Quiet attention stood in their stead. Characteristic of those twice her age. The impact of her grief had been profound, it had transformed her. No one dared to say it out loud, but the little princess's metamorphosis was plain to see. She guarded her brothers George, who asked her questions she didn't know the answers to, with all her might. Because he was too little to understand the seriousness of the situation, Louis would frequently attempt to make their mother laugh with his clumsy jokes and adorable voices. With the reality pressed down upon her, Charlotte stood as a barrier between them. With the tender touch of someone who had learned all too quickly how delicate things could be, she screened information delicately, diverted attention away from anxiety, and looked over her brothers. Along with Catherine, she transformed into a powerful yet gentle presence. She stopped waiting for someone to ask her. Her anticipation was palpable. She was already pouring water for her mother if she needed it. Whenever Catherine flinched in the light, Charlotte would silently pull the drapes back. When Charlotte's mom was too exhausted to talk, she'd sit by her side and do things like touch her hair or hum the gentle songs they used to sing. The gentle caress of her infantile charm became an ever-present balm in my life. Each of the handmade cards that adorned Catherine's nightstand had a tale to tell. Coloring pages adorned with bold phrases like, "You are my hero," and "The mummy's magic is stronger than sickness," flooded the room. Because Charlotte believed that love, when folded into paper, could do anything, she produced one every morning without fail. On particularly trying nights, she would not budge from her insistence on sleeping close by, even if it meant snuggling up on the floor under a blanket. William, who was reeling from his own emotional turmoil, started to regard Charlotte as more than just his daughter. He saw her as a stabilizing hand. She leaned in for an embrace during quiet dinners, embraced him without prompting, and gazed at him with a question he knew the answer to. "Will everything turn out okay?" They became closer. While Catherine slept in the evenings, William and Charlotte would take leisurely strolls around the garden. Recounting the many struggles Catherine had overcome, he told her tales of her mother's resilience. With her small hand firmly grasping his, Charlotte listened. It was whispered by her that she is the world's bravest woman. William, whose eyes were watering, had to avert his gaze. Charlotte had discovered wisdom beyond her years in the midst of her sorrow. The gorgeous young royal was no longer her exclusive identity. She had become a sister, a caregiver, and a daughter all at once. Finding the strength to love even when no one is looking teaches us that big deeds aren't always the best way to show our bravery. Princesses like her were becoming so rare that no one bothered to train them. Someone who leads not because of her position but because of the inner power she exudes. The heart of a nation breaks. Thursday morning was overcast when the news was announced. Kensington Palace issued a statement that was meticulously crafted and typed in the classic serif style. Essential royal briefings had become synonymous with the public. Though succinct, its significance was profound. The Princess of Wales is now in the hospital recovering from an illness. She is surrounded by her family and continues to be under the care of professionals. Despite its brevity, it conveyed a great deal. As a result of the subsequent quiet, people around the globe reacted with compassion, a rare and profoundly human emotion, rather than with criticism or rumors. All around the country, news hosts and correspondents cut their shows short. The update was featured on the top pages of newspapers, but this time the tone was far from sensational. Everyone felt bad for Princess Charlotte, the tiny girl the world had seen develop behind the royal walls, but there was no drama or gossip. Her subsequent disappearance from public view simply served to heighten the public's already palpable worry and concern. Everyone thought she was 9 years old. She is a strong and resilient twin to her mother, and she is now dealing with a personal loss that is too much for her young shoulders to handle. With an almost hallowed sensitivity, photographs of Charlotte earlier that year were recirculated, showing her beaming on school runs or clapping alongside her brothers at events. Even the unforgiving press seems to grasp the unwritten norm. It was not the right moment to probe. For once, the silence was respected by the media. Instead, they lauded Catherine's bravery and the strength of her family. And how resilient can be observed through Charlotte's deliberate retreat. According to the columnists, it was an emotional and unique display of royal humanity. The Princess of Wales and her daughter, whose personal tragedy had become an emblem of public compassion, were the subjects of an outpouring of prayers and well wishes on social media. Ensuring Charlotte's seclusion within the palace gates was a top priority. Her days were carefully planned, with shorter classes, lesson duties, and time set aside for playtime. Although it was just for a short while, the emotional burden was still there. With a look of apparent courage, she would hesitate every time she went by her mother's room and steal a quick peek at the door. Going in and out of the room, she would occasionally sit quietly. Sometimes, she would bring a book and read it loudly, even when Catherine had slept asleep, since she believed her voice could turn the world around. Around the globe, she went from being a mere child princess to something much more. She quietly became a symbol of power. Charlotte exemplified courageous love without ever speaking publicly or holding a microphone. Her story touched many hearts because it brought back memories of their own daughters who had formerly sat by hospital beds. Distant from their mundane lives, a castle reflects their own anguish. As a result of this common ground, perspectives started to change. A need for genuine moments had replaced the public's desire for regal show. A reflection of their own lives was revealed in Charlotte's tale. Demonstration that pain may strike anybody at any time, that strength can be found in vulnerability, and that love, at its most basic, unites us all. There were memorials. Postcards were sent to the royal family by the school children. A young child kneeling next to her mother is shown by a local artist wearing a flower crown. Sacred, fragile, and delicate. A song was dedicated to a daughter's quiet courage by a choir in Edinburgh. Initially, Charlotte was unaware of everything. Not to downplay the impact of the public reaction, but to safeguard her innocence, William and Catherine protected Mary from the majority of it. However, bits and pieces of it eventually got through. The letter's author is a young woman whose mother beat the same disease. Outside the palace gate, someone has left a painting. A heartfelt video message sent by a child's classroom, expressing their support for Charlotte. And in those brief moments of clarity, Charlotte started to grasp a deep concept. Her sorrow had impacted an entire country, not only her own family. She had allowed people to feel by being vulnerable. In exchange, the world embraced her quietly, respecting her heart as much as her rank. The story has transformed from a regal one into a human one. Rather than a princess atop a balcony, Charlotte stood tall in it as a sign of love amidst the brokenness. Changing the way a royal couple dates. Anmar Hall transformed into a peaceful haven for recovery in the months subsequent to the public declaration. There was less of a flurry of activity than normal due to royal engagements, governmental meetings, and school functions. The kitchen table became the site of romantic candlelight dinners in their stead. The leisurely mornings when time was defined not by schedules but by how long Catherine could sit up without tired, and the afternoon strolls through the gardens. A new rhythm, one governed by love rather than duty, had begun to unfold inside the family. What it meant to be a royal was redefined for Catherine throughout this period of her life. Graceful and ever-present, she had spent years honing the art of juggling public duty with parenting. Something new was required, nevertheless, for the sake of rehabilitation. The time she spent on appearances and picking up students from school became too much for her to handle. When given the choice, she prioritized her children, particularly Charlotte. Charlotte saw the most profound lessons of all in her decision. Through silent defiance rather than grand rituals or oratory. Motherhood was always there for Catherine, even in her darkest hours. She greeted them with kind smiles as they entered the room, read aloud to them from her bed, and her love always triumphed over her dread. She modeled for Charlotte the art of graceful combat rather than brute force. Meanwhile, Charlotte soaked it all up. Love, she realized, is more than a feeling, it's also an action. Unasked for help, she learned to braid her own hair so Catherine wouldn't have to, and she made sure her mother always had water by her bedside. She would softly murmur to herself, "I love you forever, Mommy," every night before she went to bed. A devotional ballad more powerful than a crown, it became their ritual. William leaned into the lesser moments of fatherhood as he was strained between support roles and private worry. The new medium of exchange for bonding became late-night puzzles with George, tales with Louis, and private walks with Charlotte. During those strolls, Charlotte frequently raised inappropriate questions for children. Until when will Mummy's illness end? Assuming the medication is ineffective, will she recall our names? William was never one to brush off questions that didn't have an ideal response. His sincerity, veiled in kindness, served to steady her emotions. New customs were established by the family. On Sunday nights, they would reminisce by going through old photos, reminiscing about a time before Charlotte was born, and sharing hopes and ambitions for the future. Despite the weight of the present, Catherine envisioned this as a way to show the kids that there was still room for joy. They made a scrapbook called Our Strongest Days, and Charlotte was the one who really took to it, often taking the lead in narrating stories, selecting appropriate images, and demanding that they include drawings. Love, as time went on, showed itself not in grand royal displays but in the subdued refusal to accept loss. Once again, the hallways resounded with the sound of laughter, and Charlotte's hand in baking the cookies wafted through the air. According to Lewis, there were times when Catherine would crack a smile at something ridiculous, even if she was exhausted, and the entire room would feel as though life had returned, if only for a moment. Leadership doesn't necessarily come with a crown, and Charlotte was discovering this as she sank further into this adventure than anyone had anticipated. It manifests in the vulnerability to hold on to hope even when it seems distant, in the hand-drawn cards and muttered prayers that bring comfort. Standing next to her mother, she brought brightness into a dark room. She had transformed from the girl sobbing on the carpet. Charlotte had found the subtle strength of presence in this reimagined existence as a queen. Motherhood, in Catherine's view, is now about being both gentle and strong. William had found the most regal thing of all, love, when it was free of schedule and ceremony, and he held them both. By working together, they were doing more than just making it through. They were creating an indestructible link, a legacy that would endure via folding notes, bedtime stories, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her daughter rather than anything that needed to be recorded in official archives. Love had taken on a new significance in that hallowed home, no longer as a chore or a representation, but as a promise to live up to, and they bore this promise with silent ferocity each and every day. Tear's lasting impact. Around the time spring arrived in the Norfolk countryside, Anmar Hall had undergone a change that no royal architect could have imagined. Once structured around routines and seasonal responsibilities, the house had transformed into a haven for the spirit, a place where recovery was gradual, not flawless, but very genuine. Central to it all was Charlotte, whose quiet journey through mourning had laid the groundwork for a legacy that went beyond any royal order. Catherine's road to rehabilitation was far from over. Every day had its ups and downs. On certain mornings, she would stroll hand in hand with William through the garden, her face directed towards the rising light. On other occasions, she stayed in bed entirely. Before midday, her vitality was exhausted. However, her daughter's presence remained steady throughout. A young woman molded by fire, transformed from a tiny girl. Charlotte's sobs had not diminished her strength. Something had been sparked in her by them. Spiritual fortitude, tenacity, and a more profound ability to empathize. Together with her loved ones, she started going to quiet therapy sessions where she learned to express herself emotionally and the strength that comes from acknowledging and accepting her loss. Although she was reserved at first, she eventually spoke up. She described her sadness to one therapist as a shadow. Although it remains, it does not necessarily obstruct light. Healing was also prioritized by the family. Their foundation became their joint therapy sessions, focused time together, and shared traditions. Not only did Catherine regularly urge the kids to write letters to herself, but she also encouraged them to write letters to her. The thing she would tell her heart was to tell it what you wanted it to remember. The letters that Charlotte wrote formed a record of her development. They were honest, at times vulnerable, and messy. She preserved them in a little wooden crate next to her bed, a testament to her ink and hope heritage. Adapting to their new normal, Charlotte's position within the family evolved. When Catherine was unable to assist George with his homework, she stepped in. So that her parents could relax, she let Louis play outside. At least once a week, she would gleefully announce, "We're keeping Mummy in bed today," and then she would assist William in making breakfast. The title of royal family member no longer applied to her. Her role was to aid with the recovery efforts. However, beyond the walls of Anmar Hall, a different disturbance started to emerge. Even though they were still far away, the people hadn't ignored it. The flow of letters persisted. Expressions of affection from youngsters who had witnessed a loved one's decline into weakness, mothers who had fought disease, and families who had endured such suffering. Charlotte started to perceive a larger community of loss and perseverance in those letters, a world where her tale had reverberated much beyond the royal walls. She saw herself differently after that. She had progressed beyond a state of mere reaction. It was shaping her into someone new. Even her instructors saw a change. She spoke with much consideration in class. The words of Charlotte took on a significance they had never previously in conversations concerning bravery, empathy, or kindness. "She talks like someone who understands sorrow but still believes in joy," remarked one of her teachers. Maybe that was the most significant change. It wasn't the end for Charlotte. Pain hadn't made her icy or cynical. She had discovered, on the contrary, a more profound kindness and wisdom that typically comes with age or trauma. However, hers was unique. It was fresh, full of life, and accessible. As time went on, Catherine and Charlotte became even closer. More than just love, they now shared. A shared history of survival was their bond. "She saved me in ways no one saw," Catherine would mutter to William in the middle of the night as she gazed in wonder at her daughter. William, with the expressionless pride of a parent, would nod in agreement. They would never hear the tale of this time in their life proclaimed with royal proclamations or trumpets, but it would be felt. In the way Charlotte held her mother closer for an extra second, in the way William's voice took on a softer quality, and in the times when laughter